Welcome to the second part of this ACPE core curriculum, evidence-based practice and research webinar. Hopefully from hearing our stories and our interests in research and the reason we've come together to make this webinar, you've come to realize that we're doing this because we all believe that research literacy is now a necessary skill for everyone practicing spiritual care in any context, but also because we're excited about using research and teaching the skills to use research in our CPE programs. So why is this module being added to the core curriculum for certified educators? First of all, research literacy is linked to accountability. We need to be accountable to those in our care, to those who support and fund our work, and to our learners in CPE. And linked to that is we are to be good stewards of the resources we have, knowing that our resources aren't unlimited, and research can help us make hard decisions about the best ways to focus the resources we have. Also, to be lifelong learners. A big part of professional development now in any kind of setting is continually learning best practices to make our work more effective and better for those that we serve. We also want to model that spirit of inquiry and excitement about continually improving our work to the learners that come to us in CPE. And finally, we are helping prepare people to meet the spiritual care common standards for board certification, and some of us may be board certified chaplains ourselves. And there are competencies that require us to demonstrate research literacy and use it on a regular basis. And it's now a part of the competencies for becoming a certified educator, ACPE certified educator. So we want you to learn the following things as a result of this module. If this is your first experience with learning about research literacy, you won't be done at the end of this webinar, but hopefully you will come to understand the importance of evidence-based practice and research in clinical pastoral education. And you'll see that it's not anything new. There's a long history of inquiry and continual learning as we reflect on our experiences and come back and apply that learning to our practice. It's congruent with what we've always done in CPE. We also want you to be able to talk about and write about the use of evidence-based practice as spiritual care practitioners. We also want you to go away from this aware of resources that you can use in your ongoing work to become research literate and also to teach this and include it in your curriculum. I know myself, I subscribe to a couple of regular research emails that send me a monthly list of vetted research that I can quickly read and apply to my work. And finally, we want you to be able to begin incorporating research literacy skills. You may not teach it, but you will understand what needs to be taught and how to contact those who can help bring those skills to your learners in CPE as you make this a regular part of your curricula. I'm now going to turn it over to Chaba, who will begin our presentation.
As we are getting started, I want to underscore the importance of integration when it comes to using and incorporating research in spiritual care and education. When research started gaining momentum in chaplaincy, it was often viewed as an either-or proposition, as something that takes away from or diminishes the art or the heart of what we do. Or at least it was debated as a competing priority. But this is a false dichotomy. I invite you, rather, to take on a both-and mindset right at the beginning of our presentation, which hopefully will help you engage and make use of these materials. We need to apply this both-and approach at 3 levels. First, we need to consider both the art and the science of how we educate about and provide spiritual care. There is ample space for the both for both the art and the sacredness, and the mind of understanding, the rigorous examination and reflection on my practice and our practices. You will hear more about evidence-based practice later, which calls for the integration of your expertise, the characteristics of your students, care recipients, and the best available research evidence. One is not more important than the other. The goal is integration. Second, I encourage you to hold space for your hesitation, anxiety, overwhelm, or questions about research and its value on the one hand. And on the other hand, lean into an open mindset and curiosity as you learn about research. Look for connections and what it has to say for you, for your practice right now, and what it has to say more in the future as you continue learning more about research and evidence-based practice. And the third level of both and approach is, as you listen to this presentation, reflect on both on yourself and your students, how research, literacy, and evidence-based practice are relevant for you as an educator. And how would you help your students develop their basic research literacy so they can become evidence-based practitioners of spiritual care? We are in good company when we talk about research and evidence-based practice in CPE. Research is not new and has never been alien to CPE and chaplaincy because it offers systemic methods to observe and reflect on the living human document. Anton Boysen wrote, "What is new in the attempt to begin with the study of living human document rather than books, and to focus attention upon those who are grappling with the issues of spiritual life and death." In his work, Boysen blended this attention to spiritual life with his interest in research and psychology. So one way of looking at research is the study of living human documents, using disciplined and systemic approaches, which lead to new knowledge and insights, and thus inform what we do, how we educate and provide care. So let's talk more about what research is. Understanding research is foundational building block for research literacy and evidence-based practice. So what do you think about this approach to research? What is research and what is the goal and value of research? Do we think that research is only for the sake of research? Is it just questioning for the sake of questioning? Are we talking about research because we have to, or is there something more to it? Or we can also look at research from this perspective. I invite you to think about how can research be meaningful and purposeful for you in your context. You can read in this quote that curiosity has its own reason for existing. It is about contemplating the mysteries of eternity, of life, of the marvelous structure of reality. It is enough if we try merely comprehend a little of this mystery every day. The use and conduct of research proposes that research is an endeavor of curiosity, knowing, meaning-making with a purpose to generate knowledge and comprehend even just a little of the mystery. So one simple way to define research is that it is the disciplined and systemic approach to asking and answering questions that result in new knowledge. We do this all the time. We ask questions and we do our best to answer them. We ask questions about our practice and about the persons we serve. When a student says about a patient that they were in despair, you may ask your student, what made you think that? What signs or evidence did you see or hear in your assessment of this patient? And research expands our ability to ask questions, maybe about a whole group of patients who experience despair during hospitalization. Or maybe it gives us ways to document and analyze a series of conversations with a single person to deeply explore their lived experience of despair. Research simply applies agreed upon, transparent, and systemic methods in order to minimize bias and ensure the validity and reliability of its findings. It is an imperfect process that yields very valuable yet incomplete answers. And as such, it is our responsibility to critically evaluate the validity of any research, as well as its implication for my practice. So you see some questions on this slide that I encourage you to ask wherever you encounter research about where did their questions come from, how did they go about answering that question, and how these answers may be useful for me in my practice and context. And this is just an illustration of what research is or can be. This is an illustration of the wide variety of what research is, because research is not one single thing. We need to expand our frame of reference about what questions we can ask and the many ways we can go about answering those questions by using research. There is a broad variety or diversity of methods and theories undergirding research that has also a variety of purposes of context. You can do research or you can read research that is done with a single person. Or you can look at research that has been done with hundreds or thousands of people. Research may examine narratives, images, or numerical survey responses. And one methodology is not more valid than the other. Context is everything. What, why, and where I'm carrying out research for. This diverse universe of research, this is a diverse universe of research in which both researchers and evidence-based practitioners can find their authentic place, and they can find what works with who they are and what they do in their practice. So let's look at some common misconceptions about research that we often encounter in our field. We often think mistakenly that empirical research is the only valid approach to truth, or we assume that research claims that it is the only valid approach to truth. Later on, you're going to see and hear about that research is one of many ways of knowing. There is one of many ways of understanding our reality. That is also a misconception that research involves numbers and statistics, or involves only numbers or statistics. As I said, sometimes it involves narratives, or sometimes it involves other forms of expressions of self. That's also a misconception that all chaplains should be able to conduct research. As you see, there are different levels of research literacy or different levels of research use. And we are often looking at this basic level of being able to use research in an informed way. And we don't have to become scientists to carry out research. As we said in our introductions, there is so many ways to be involved and collaborate and use research in our field. And research is not about technical, boring, and difficult process, but it's about understanding our lived experiences. Research also inherently contains the biases, the agendas, the objectives of the researchers. And that's something that we need to understand and critically reflect upon. Researchers are also not always removed critical observers of others. There are many ways doing research when actually the researcher becomes a participant in the lived experiences of their persons they are researching. And the other misconceptions often people bring to research in our field is that research takes away the sacredness or the mystery of spirituality, religion, chaplaincy, or CPE. So as we move into this presentation, let's consider where our motivations and purposes may lie in using and integrating research in our professional practice. Research and evidence-based practice builds on the foundation of a sense of curiosity combined with the sense of reverence. There is a professional imperative to be engaged in research and engaged in using research. This is an intentional foundation for critical reflections on our practices. It's about a curiosity about what happens in the moment. And we need to be research-informed practitioners, whether as an educators or chaplains. Secondly, there is this economic challenge that research is becoming a very valuable strategy for strengthening chaplaincy and chaplaincy education in the changing healthcare context. As we all know, we are constantly being asked about what is the evidence for our practice? What is the reason why we are asking for expanding spiritual care programs or CPE programs? There is an increased scrutiny on how, why, and where money is spent. So doing research or understanding and knowing the research about my field will help you advocate for your programs and for a profession. Third is that research, can you go to the next slide, please? That research sustains and enlivens our practices and our well-being. Research provides opportunities to deepen our vocational engagement and bringing new energy and new questions and new stimulation to our practice as well as to our field. And finally, research is a conversation partner that underpins practice. Research strengthens the link between our reflective practice and the evidence that's available to us. Research may help us to intentionally engage with recent and relevant findings and theological or spiritual reflection on our practice. It would help us to put the findings in practice and do it in our context in a way that helps us continuously reflect on our practice and enhance our practices in spiritual care. So I will pause here for a moment and I will invite the rest of our group to share if they have any reflections or comments. If not, I will turn it over to Lex.
Thanks, Chava. I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about the method of science and how that method of science undergirds research and is also closely tied to CPE as an experiential process education carried out in real work clinical context. So I'll be following up on some of what Chava was talking about in terms of figuring out what works and also, sort of scratching that itch of curiosity. If you will, the scientific method is the foundation of research. And as you will find out later, more so in this presentation, inseparable from evidence-based practice. Not unlike CPE and process education in general, the scientific method is rooted in the philosophical school of thought known as pragmatism. Pragmatism is made popular for many of us by John Dewey, who was heavily influenced by Charles Peirce and William James. Most of us are familiar with James's book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and many know of Dewey's writings that articulate the conditions that facilitate learning, particularly learning experientially in the clinical context. Perhaps fewer of us in CPE are as familiar with pragmatism as a school of thought. So let me share with you two key tenets of pragmatism. One is that truth or knowledge is grounded in utility, namely the exploration of real world problems and trying to figure out what works. That's fundamentally what happens when a CPE student encounters a challenging clinical dilemma. The student seeks to find a solution, namely a way to respond to a spiritual crisis that leads to a desired outcome, the resolution of that crisis. But even if the student finds a solution to a given clinical situation, we know that learning doesn't end there, if you will. The veracity, the truth and utility of that solution depends on its ability to stand up to repeated experience, inquiry, and investigation. The question to be asked is, will that same solution transfer to another similar clinical context or different patient situation? Another fundamental tenet of pragmatism is that individuals seek a state of equilibrium. That is, they adhere to the status quo and cling to what's familiar and safe. Pierce and James suggest that the common methods of achieving satisfaction or familiarity, namely tenacity, authority, and a priori intuition, are means of maintaining the status quo and become barriers to utility. They further suggest that the motivation for one to change comes only when one enters a state of dissatisfaction, when one's desires outcomes remain unmet. Such is the dilemma faced by the student who discovers that what they know may be insufficient for subsequent clinical encounters. And as we move to the next slide, we can take a brief look at how this applies to education. When applied to learning, Dewey suggests that these methods of maintaining the status quo can become actual barriers to learning if tightly adhered to in the face of experience and investigation. Reflect for a moment, if you will. When you think of your own learning process or your encounter with students with whom you're learning to supervise, do these barriers sound familiar? Tenacity. How many times have you said or seen somebody cling to what is comfortable or familiar when they're afraid? We often cling to what is known to maintain comfort. And when we maintain comfort, we resist change. Or the barrier of authority, when we appeal to tradition as the answer, claiming it's always been that way, or I was taught that way, or scripture tells me such and such. And that becomes the tight and enduring answer. Or the a priori method based on intuition, where one says it's true or not because it feels right or it feels wrong, or I'll know it when I see it. We've said that often about a level of competence. We'll know it when we see it without the evidence to support that determination, leaving truth to be fundamentally a subjective concept. Next slide, please. Pragmatism, on the other hand, offers the alternative of the scientific method. Like CPE, the method of science is based on experience. It asks the question, how does a held truth hold up to public test or experiment, as well as to objective investigation? Is there evidence to support this truth? Is the evidence reasonable? And is it achieved by consensus and repeated investigation. In the next slide, we'll look a little bit about Dewey's application to the scientific method. For Dewey, I think you may know this, how to think was as important as what to think. That process in learning was as critical as content. Thinking was based on observation, experimentation, and repetition in an effort to build evidence for a reasonable conclusion or a solution to a utilitarian problem. Conclusions in Dewey's thinking were understood to be assumptions of truth and not static truth, meaning that truth is always subject to ongoing inquiry and ongoing investigation. As such, knowledge, if you will, holds a heuristic quality. In CPE, spiritual care and education as we know it mirrors that philosophy. Next slide. Again, for Dewey, the scientific method is the foundation of education. Echoing back to pragmatism, learning begins with a felt need. Something needs to be different in order to achieve a state of satisfaction. This parallels the basis of adult education, where the learner seeks solutions to real problems, to real and meaningful problems. How do I, as an aspiring spiritual care provider, respond to a fearful patient with a new cancer diagnosis? The same need applies to the CPE educator in training, whose intervention with a student is met with apparent resistance. Maybe you've seen that happen. As an educator, your commitment not only to utility, but curiosity would lead you to further inquiry and experimentation. Why didn't it work? What alternatives need to be explored to find a satisfactory solution? And we'll move on to the final slide. This will look familiar to you. You know the action reflection model of learning is foundational for CPE. In CPE, whether it applies to you or one of your students, experience is the beginning and the end of learning. And the process in between, informed by the method of science, drives the model. Learning begins with experience, such as the student-patient or student-client interaction. It moves to observation and reflection that combines introspection with feedback from others. What worked? What didn't work? An analysis of the data, the findings from the feedback you receive, produces evidence that moves towards generalization and abstract conceptualization. The question then becomes, how does the evidence from this experience stand up to other existing sources of knowledge? How might existing theory inform the development of new hypotheses to address what didn't work? In the end, the action reflection model teaches us that the ends of education are not fixed, but rather focused on the promotion of reflective behavior and growth through change. It is essential, therefore, that one sees the reciprocal relationship between theory and practice, so that teaching is understood as more than a personal activity without grounding in scientific and theoretical methodology. I'm going to stop there to see if any of the folks would like to comment.
I just appreciate you reminding us, Lex, that even though this is a new competency we're focusing on in the certification process, evidence-based understanding is not new to our practice and to our field. It's just kind of like learning a new language and a new set of lenses for looking at this. But we've always been doing evidence-based care, I think, in CPE. Well, I invite you to think with me for just a minute about what we really mean when we talk about evidence-based care. Had a good introduction into what research is and the historic roots of using this way of approaching learning. In any profession, if we can go to the next slide, competent practitioners are continually asking questions, just like we encourage our learners in CPE to be curious when they encounter challenges, barriers, disorienting dilemmas, and to respond by asking questions instead of feeling stuck. Practitioners who are seeking to carry out evidence-based care are constantly asking, what is the evidence for this intervention we're using? And how do we provide the very best practice? And asking, are we achieving the highest possible outcomes for our patients, our families, our medical teams, our stakeholders? And doing things the way we've always done them is not going to ensure quality outcomes, because new knowledge is always coming forth and can always change the way we understand a problem or a situation and what's the best way to address it. So just relying on myths or hunches or this is the way we've always done it is not good enough in evidence-based care. And the first step in being a practitioner of evidence-based care is understanding where the evidence we're using comes from. There's different levels and different sources of evidence. One of the first is the opinion, the insight, the experience of people who've been practitioners for a long time. We may attend grand rounds or read case studies or attend interdisciplinary rounds. And then there is a lot of focus in healthcare and in other settings too now on quality improvement, in which we do small tests of change to improve outcomes. The focus is on quick learning, application, changing once we've had a little bit of understanding of whether this change is working or not. Quality improvement also focuses on the culture of a practice. It is focusing on teaching all who work in a particular setting to have the attitudes, behaviors, and actions of always seeking to provide the best outcomes and being willing to look at mistakes or problems as an opportunity for learning. Quasi-experimental designs are done in situations in which it's impractical or unethical to conduct randomly designed research projects. Sometimes lowers the validity of the outcomes, but it can achieve good results in a shorter amount of time. And in healthcare, again, this kind of design is often used because it may not be ethical to do fully randomized controlled trials around certain concerns or needs. And then formal research includes a wide variety of methodology and means going through formal protocols such as approval by an institutional review board to ensure that the participants' safety is being considered and their confidentiality and that they're informed of any risks. The type of research questions we're wanting to know, what it is we're wanting to learn, determines the methods we use. So a desire to learn more about or observe a phenomena may lead a researcher to use qualitative methods like interviews, observations, focus groups, or surveys. Scientific and medical research more often relies on quantitative methods and statistical analysis. And then there's also mixed methods research studies that combine both qualitative and quantitative analysis. And then the gold standard of scientific research is a randomized control trial. And in the next slide, we'll see that looking at it in kind of a hierarchical view, random controlled trials are at the top of the hierarchy. With this type of research, we have very reliable outcomes. We can trust the quality of the findings. We also have a much lower risk of bias because we have control groups in which We randomly select participants to either receive the treatment or not receive the treatment. So comparing the results has much less risk of bias. And the thing is, even though this is a hierarchy, every level of evidence is important and useful and applicable in different situations. So we need to kind of understand this as we seek to consult the research findings that are available to us, and not just use one, but recognize that evidence-based practice allows us to consult all of these. An interesting example that I found out about recently, I had a friend I didn't know had been in a trial to study the vaccine for COVID. And once they found that it was effective, she was immediately given the chance to leave the study, find out if she had been in the treatment group or the control group. She'd been in the control group, so she had not been receiving it. So then she was given the opportunity to receive the vaccine, because it would have been unethical to withhold that from her once it was determined that the vaccine was effective. So many different levels with different amount of resources needed for each type of research. Although most of us in the field of spiritual care won't be conducting formal scientific research, a few of us will, or may join with others in doing that. We all probably could have opportunities to join interdisciplinary quality improvement teams. Doing this has many benefits. I've had many opportunities to do this, and it allows me to gain more understanding of how to read and evaluate research to apply to my own work. And it allows me to learn different methodology commonly used by nurses and others in healthcare. One of the most common that I've been trained in and have used is called PDSA, or Plan, Do, Study, Act. In this model, a goal or an outcome is identified by consulting the literature about a particular patient population or a particular problem in the care. And then small tests of change are conducted to quickly determine what changes provide better outcomes and what don't seem to provide as good of outcomes. And so best practices developed through this process of small cycles of interventions. There's other quality improvement methodologies you'll hear about, such as Six Sigma or Lean. All of these models are quality improvement processes designed to improve outcomes and decrease inefficiencies in providing care. Many quality improvement goals require the input of all members of the interdisciplinary team, so spiritual care practitioners really need to be familiar with the methods. Many organizations focus on creating a culture of continuous quality improvement, as I mentioned previously, which includes empowering frontline workers, people giving the care, to identify problems and suggest improvements. And it also focuses on creating a culture, a non-punitive response to mistakes or problems, and instead a culture of viewing problems as opportunities for learning, something we're all very familiar with in CPE. Most workplaces have regular training for those interested in developing their skills in process improvement and quality improvement. And if you're interested in this, I encourage you to take a class and learn these skills and join some kind of project going on in your workplace. By participating in quality improvement, we build interdisciplinary alliances that help all the members of the care team value the contributions of spiritual care in achieving best outcomes for the persons in our care, which may include patients, residents, inmates, clients, or a wide range of other people served in our context. And the interdisciplinary work of quality improvement moves us away from working in silos to a team approach in our care and our service to others. So these three categories are important to really understand and be able to describe. Process improvement asks, are we doing what we do in the best possible way? And if not, how can we do it better? An example of a process improvement project I was able to participate in was an interdisciplinary group seeking to reduce readmissions of high-risk groups of people once they're discharged from the hospital. Evidence-based practice is an ongoing process of knowing what the research tells us about how to achieve the best outcomes in our work. It requires a regular practice of reading and discussing research with our colleagues and then applying it to our practice. And then research asks what? What can we know that we don't already know about a particular problem, disease, or situation? The researcher sets out to prove or disprove a hypothesis, and the research is considered successful if the original question or hypothesis is disproved, often called the null hypothesis. Knowing something doesn't work is as important as knowing it does work when it comes to best practice in any field. Finding direct causation is very difficult in research, and it usually takes many studies for a new treatment or method to be determined to be highly effective. So evidence drives clinical practice, including the practice of spiritual care, when we see better outcomes, when the people who receive our care are getting interventions provided by us on using the best and latest evidence, and when we see fewer unwanted results, such as complications or readmissions. As spiritual care educators and clinicians, we can join our colleagues in other disciplines to continually change our practice based on reading and evaluating the research in our own field of spiritual care, as well as related fields of knowledge that inform our work. So I'll ask my team now if they have any other comments to add to this section. And if not, I'll turn it over to Biba.
Beth, we're going to talk later about some of the ways in which people can incorporate some of this into their CPE programs. But clearly, one of the things that folks would want to do when they go to a new place is become friends with the performance improvement team at your organization. And depending on the size and complexity of your setting, they may or may not know some of the questions you have, number one, or observations you see about how things are happening and what's going well in the organization as somebody new to that organization.
Mm-hmm.
But also, they may not know about chaplains and how chaplains might be able to contribute to organizational goals.
I agree. There's a lot of research on spirituality being done by non-chaplains, by nurses, physicians, case managers, social workers. So I think our voice needs to be heard as one of the experts when it comes to this interdisciplinary application of best knowledge to best practice.
Okay. We see evidence-based practice as an integration of these three components. That's the clinical expertise, the patient preferences, and the best available evidence. So we can say that the evidence can come from different sources. It can come from research. It can come from our past experiences and knowledge and skills that we gain as we go along, as well as from patients and families' experiences. I see this integration as the three components informing each other. And an example that comes to mind for me, which I want to say, it's a study that we did at Mayo Clinic. It was a spiritual life review process for patients with advanced cancer. We explored the patient's values, their beliefs, and their experiences. And the intervention that we provided for this study was a spiritual legacy document that we created for each patient based on those values and experiences. We realized at the end of the study that the outcomes were an improved spiritual well-being, emotional well-being, and religious coping. And so there was this combination of these three components coming together. There was evidence, for example, that spiritual life review was an important process for patients with advanced diseases. Then there was the clinical expertise that chaplains brought, as well as members of other disciplines who joined this study. So to these two, with the patient's values and beliefs, was a combination that brought about this evidence-based practice. And to me, this is a great example because the palliative care department at Mayo is now using this intervention, and they are using it because they know that it has been vetted and validated. So evidence from research can provide standardized protocols and interventions and practices that can guide our clinical practice. So why is evidence important? Evidence provides for us, as I said earlier, current and innovative practices that has been tested and validated in other places. So it's important to know what others are thinking and doing, and we can use that to inform our own practice. So with the availability of well-documented interventions, there is a chance for that, as I mentioned in the example that I gave earlier. Evidence is important because it keeps us updated about new protocols for patient care. For example, maybe one of your students might come up to you and mention a challenge and ask, how are they able to provide care to maybe patients in the ICU who are on the ventilator? And you might redirect them to find evidence to find out if there are other places or other interventions that people are using. And this happened to me. I'm giving this example because this happened to me. And I said, let me just look at the literature and see what is there. Then I discovered this study that was done in New York, where the chaplains use a picture guided card to communicate with patients who were on the vent. And they realized that about 81% of these patients were comfortable, felt capable of dealing with their hospitalization. And because of this evidence that was available for us, myself and some of my colleagues decided to try it in our setting. And we saw that it was working for some of the patients. So that is what evidence does. It helps us, it transforms our clinical practice, it moves it forward. So it provides us with what has been done in specific populations and specific settings. So now let's look at evidence-based spiritual care. And it's just so interesting that in our everyday work, we listen to patients' stories, we provide interventions that alleviate suffering and bring comfort. But to me, I've come to realize that this gives us only snapshots of the work that we do, of the spiritual care that we provide. For example, if I provide this guided imagery to a patient who is waiting for organ transplants, and it works very well, and I become excited and call my friend in another institution and say, I want you to start providing guided imagery as an intervention to patients who are waiting for organ transplants. There is no scientific backing to that because I only got the feedback of one patient. But if research is done, research will be able to verify the efficacy of the use of guided imagery for patients waiting for organ transplants. And so that is what that is how we can use this scientific evidence to be able to improve on our spiritual care. And there's a lot of research out there with different kinds of interventions that we can use on our patients. As Beth and Lex mentioned earlier, there are people from other disciplines like social work, even physicians doing research on spiritual care, and we can partner with these people to be able to see the best possible ways that we can bring up good outcomes for our patient care. And I would also add here that it is important now for chaplains or your students to have access to these resources. So it's not only for us to know that we can use evidence to improve our care, but where do we find that evidence? Where can we find that resources? And at the end of these PowerPoints, we are going to bring up some of those resources that we can use. So evidence, what is the rationale? Why do we really care? Why do we care about evidence-based practice? Could we move to this next slide, please? So evidence-based practice is an approach that is in opposition to maybe rule of thumb, folklore, tradition, or that is expert opinion only. And Lex mentioned this earlier, that this could be barriers. This could be barriers of learning when we say we've always done it this way. Now we would stick to the way that we've always done it. So as I've explained earlier, evidence is the best way to do it. We know what others are thinking, we know what others are doing, we know the interventions that have been validated, that have been tested. And when I was in my doing my residency, I realized early on that assessment was a very important component of my spiritual care, because if I'm not able to assess patients, then I'll not be able to provide care to them. So in the past decade, there have been research on different kinds of spiritual care assessment tools. And so there is evidence that when we use these tools that have been validated, then it will give us the best practice on how to assess our patients and give them the best possible care.